When people talk about the Beatles, one subject always comes up. Who wrote the best songs? John Lennon and Paul McCartney were the powerhouse behind the group's most famous tracks. But George Harrison often stood in the shadows, quietly waiting for his turn. And yet, when Harrison was asked later in life about the band's catalog, he gave a surprising answer. Despite years of frustration, rivalry, and neglect, George admitted that he believed Paul McCartney had written some of the very best Beatles songs. It was a comment that revealed both his admiration and the complicated dynamics that had shaped the band from the start. To understand the weight of Harrison's statement, we need to go back to the beginning. In the early 1960s, the Beatles were driven by the partnership of Lennon and McCartney. The two had begun writing together as teenagers and quickly established themselves as the creative leaders of the band. Their songs dominated the early albums, while Harrison was left with only an occasional contribution. He was the lead guitarist, not the main songwriter, and he knew it. But George was ambitious. He studied Lennon and McCartney's writing, practiced obsessively, and began to experiment with his own compositions. Still, in the Lennon-McCartney world, it was nearly impossible to break through. George's first real attempt came with Don't Bother Me in 1963, but it was treated more like a curiosity than a highlight. Even as the band evolved and their sound grew more complex, George was only allowed 1 or 2 tracks per album. For every Harrison song, there were 10 from Lennon or McCartney. The imbalance gnawed at him, and it fueled one of the deepest sources of tension inside the band. But here's where the contradiction lies. Harrison might have resented the way his songs were overlooked, but he was also quick to recognize genius when he saw it. In particular, he admired Paul's craftsmanship. Paul had an ability to polish a melody, to structure a song so that it sounded effortless, and to turn simple ideas into masterpieces. Harrison could be openly critical of Paul's bossy nature in the studio, but when it came to the music itself, he sometimes admitted that Paul had produced works that were, in his words, the best. Take Yesterday, for example. When Paul brought it to George Martin and recorded it without the rest of the band, the others were skeptical. Lennon dismissed it. Harrison seemed indifferent at the time. Yet, in later years, Harrison would point to that song as an undeniable achievement. It wasn't rock and roll in the traditional sense, but it was a perfectly constructed piece of music that had a timeless quality. George knew it, even if he didn't always say it aloud in the 1960s. Another track Harrison admired was Hey Jude. By 1968, the band was fracturing. The White Album sessions had been tense, with George walking out at one point in frustration. But when Paul sat down to record Hey Jude, Harrison recognized it as something different. Even though he personally clashed with Paul during the sessions, George later admitted that the song was one of the greats. It was expansive, emotional, and unlike anything else in their catalog. For all the bitterness he felt toward Paul's controlling nature, Harrison couldn't deny the brilliance of the music. This is the paradox of George Harrison's relationship with Paul McCartney. On one hand, George often felt suffocated by Paul. He described him as domineering, unwilling to let others contribute freely in the studio. During the Let It Be sessions, this tension exploded into open arguments, with Harrison famously snapping at Paul in frustration. He resented being told how to play his guitar parts. He resented how Paul treated him as a sideman rather than an equal. But on the other hand, George also looked at songs like Let It Be or Here, There, and Everywhere, and admitted that Paul had reached a level of songwriting few others could match. In contrast, George's view of John Lennon was different. He loved John as a friend and admired his wit, but he sometimes saw John's songwriting as more erratic. Lennon could produce raw brilliance, but he could also drift into what Harrison thought of as self-indulgence. For George, Paul's consistency stood out. Paul was methodical, disciplined, and relentlessly focused on the craft of songwriting. Even when George clashed with him personally, he had to acknowledge that Paul delivered some of the best material the Beatles ever recorded. One telling example came in the late 1980s, when Harrison was asked to reflect on the Lennon-McCartney partnership. He didn't hesitate to say that Paul had written songs that, in his opinion, were the very best of the group. He wasn't being sentimental, nor was he trying to rewrite history. He was simply acknowledging what had been obvious all along, that despite the conflicts, Paul's melodies and compositions were among the strongest in popular music. This honesty is remarkable, because George could easily have chosen to promote his own legacy. By then, he had proven himself as a songwriter, with tracks like Something and Here Comes the Sun. In fact, Frank Sinatra once called Something the greatest love song ever written. Harrison had every right to boast about his own work. Yet when pressed about the Beatles' best songs, he still gave the nod to Paul. It showed a humility that contrasted sharply with the public battles he had fought with McCartney in the 1970s. The irony is that George's own breakthrough as a songwriter happened only after Paul and John's dominance began to wane. On Abbey Road, Harrison finally had space to shine, contributing two of the album's strongest tracks. For many fans, Something and Here Comes the Sun are highlights of the Beatles' entire catalog. But even then, George didn't see himself as outshining the others. He considered his contributions valuable, yes, but he still regarded Paul's best songs as the standard to measure against. In truth, Harrison's recognition of Paul's talent speaks volumes about the complicated brotherhood that defined the Beatles. They fought, they resented each other, they competed constantly, but beneath it all was respect. George may have rolled his eyes at Paul's perfectionism, but he also knew that without that perfectionism, many of the Beatles' greatest songs would never have existed.